Very nice keyboard there. Right, well, thank you for having me. I'm back in the Netherlands after a shockingly brief absence. I can't seem to stay away from your glamorous country. Yeah, you know, I am a science fiction writer, and yeah, when I write about design, I tend to write about it in a rather visionary way, and as Alex was pointing out, that little book of mine was rather difficult to summarize. But I've come here to talk about food and, you know, biotech and radical agriculture rather than cyber issues. You know, and I thought it was funny that the little poster for this event describes me as a biopunk rather than a cyberpunk. And you know, naturally, I'm quite interested in biotechnology as an industry journalist and somebody who writes for Wired magazine, and you know, is very interested in the sort of cyber trade press. I have wondered for a long time when there would be a transition between the kind of 80s, 90s cyber world into a, you know, early 21st century bio world. And I used to suggest that to my colleagues at Wired that they ought to be prepared to change their magazine's name to Gelled. You know, something a bit more ribosome-like and up-to-date. And my colleague, Paul DeFilippo, who's also a cyberpunk science fiction writer, he's keenly interested in things biological more so than I. And he and I collaborated once on a story called The Scab's Progress, which sort of mechanically goes through the cyberpunk discourse and detourns it on a new biological framework. So you can look this up, and it's basically a William Gibson caper story from around 1984, in which everything is reframed in terms of genetics and stolen DNA, and you know, and it's sort of clever, and I really like the texture of the neologisms in that story, but it did not go very far, and I'm interested in why. I mean, why is it that biotech is not really very frameable? And, you know, the kind of discourse of high-tech or cyber technology. I mean, why doesn't that work? And I think it's got something to do with this, right? I mean, this would be food. And, you know, and like food is part of us. So if I'm like throwing ideas out to you, it doesn't seem to make that much difference. Whereas we're actually like made out of food. I mean, food is not rhetorical. Food is like, you know, a thing with some everyday use substance. You know, why doesn't the metaphor fit? I mean, why wasn't biotechnology sort of as smoothly accepted as the computer revolution out of Silicon Valley? I was happy to do that because in Torino, where I spend a lot of my time, we have an event called Share Festival. I was the curator this year, and one of their habits in Turinese cyberculture is to feed people. I mean, they just have these sort of cyber events, and just as a matter of Italian everyday practice, there's just some food around. And it's alarming how vitalizing this is on these sort of pale keyboard punching hackers. You'd think they'd be in there talking about software, but on the contrary, they swarm over to the table to grab these Piedmontese hors d'oeuvres. And I must say that the new curator of this year's Share Festival is Andy Cameron from the Fabrica Design School. And Andy had a copy of V2's latest publication, the Interact or Die. You know, I've read a lot of V2 publications. I'm really quite the fan of the organization here. That one's really good. I mean, you know, I mean, that's really a good book. I stole that book from Andy Cameron. Literally, I took it off his desk, I put it in my bag, he still doesn't have it back. You know, I've read it all, his copy's like underlined all over the place. I have the benefits of his interventions in the text. I'm gonna have to get another one so I can have one and then mail Andy's back before Christmas. I'm not kidding, it's really a good book. So, yes, people are made out of food, cities are made out of agriculture. I mean, before there was agriculture, there were no cities. You have to have some kind of agricultural base. You can't have a city. If you have a trans-agriculture, this has to imply some kind of trans-city. So I thought I'd point that out. And why at 2009, why did we have an event with a framework like trans-agriculture rather than the good old-fashioned 80s style framework, which would be frankenfood biotechnology horror? Why not just go ahead and just say Frankenstein on the front instead of using the sort of sexy term trans? Well, I think something has changed here, and since the discourse, the sort of anti-food discourse, anti-biotech food discourse of the 80s, which was the birth of the slow food movement. I will get to that, but I don't want to repeat what you've already got in your little folder there. What happened? I really don't think the business model works very well there. I don't think it was really, there were two major problems. First, biotechnology is a lot harder than it looks. I would recommend Denise Caruso's book, Intervention, which is written by a San Francisco tech journalist with a lot of background in cyber stuff and internet policy. She's a New York Times technology editor for a while, very, very technically knowledgeable woman who comes from a kind of cyberculture background and went in to investigate biotechnology, and is a science reporter. And she wrote this book, Interventions, which is about the gap between where biotechnology science actually is and our attempt to commodify it and sort of move it up into mass production and make it fit into the sort of standard neoliberal model where, cyber high-tech stuff worked extremely well under that model, except for the inevitable bubbles and collapses, whereas biotech really never got that kind of cachet. It was easy to make cyber technology sexy and very difficult to make biotechnology sexy in the same way. There is cyberpunk, but there really isn't a functional biopunk. And why is that? Well, two reasons. One, having to do with commerce, and another having to do with science. And Denise's book implies that the science just does not work. You read this thing, and it's basically framed in a very European precautionary principle style. It's basically a litany of horrors and possible accidents that can happen from, just messing about with the DNA of crop plants. And yes, clearly it's a very powerful technology, so there are many possible downsides to it. But also, I think she makes a very good case that we just really don't know how cells work, how cells combine into tissues, how tissues combine into edible products. We really just don't know how to use this particular set of quite limited understandings in order to make better food. Food that people are actually willing to pay some extra money for. It just hasn't worked out very well. Why isn't Genentech, well, I wanted to say bigger than General Motors, but that was a terrible thing to say. Why isn't Genentech bigger than whatever large company has not yet failed? Why did not Genentech become one of our major global Zaibatsu-style McDonald's? Why isn't Genentech bigger than McDonald's? They don't really have any good products. When was the last time you went out to a shelf and saw something labeled that says, fresh from Genentech? Or Ciron, your friend. Why isn't Ciron or Chiron bigger than General Electric? Why isn't there, as William Gibson prophesied in one of his early cyberpunk novels, why isn't there a Mitsubishi Genentech? Just kind of an overwhelming global super thing. Well, they just don't make that much money. They've absorbed incredible amounts of venture capital and they just have not really managed to do it. And it isn't because of, organized leftist resistance from the discourse of the popular whatever. There's a little bit of that, but it hasn't really done it. It isn't because of the terrible possibilities. There hasn't really been a genetic Chernobyl yet. Obviously there's a possibility of one. I wrote a short story along this line many years ago our neural Chernobyl. You know, there hasn't really been a genetic horror story, you know, that goes with our other major industrial accidents. Even the horror of genetics hasn't really lived up to the hype. You know, the science doesn't seem to work out, and the business also has not really been very friendly to this particular intervention. They're kind of falling into a boring sump of popular disinterest, you know, combined with the occasional philosophical attack. And they're kind of becoming a sister technology to nuclear power and radio frequency identity, both of which are like super sexy ideas in an abstract way, but do not work out in popular practice, I mean, and in everyday use. There's not a lot of everyday use for radio frequency ID chips. There's not a lot of everyday use for nuclear power, I mean, except for the wall plug. You can't have your own nuclear oven. You know, you can't go out and buy something with a neat little sort of nuclear sign stamped on the side and say, wow, I'm nuclear, you know? They're like, that's terrific, I'm atomic. Or it's like, oh, this is great, I get to like follow my own RFID tracking Orwellian chain. I mean, I argue in my book, Shaping Things, that it's logical that we should do that, and we just sort of need to re-engineer it and do it in a better way. But, you know, nuclear power makes a lot of sense in the ways of the laws of physics as a method to sort of integrate itself in the way we behave militarily, governmentally. It really is a brittle form of power. And biotechnology is sort of similarly fragile. It's very dependent on things like interlocking and extremely elaborate intellectual property and patenting schemes. I mean, this is the way you're supposed to like squeeze some money out of all this elaborate Monsanto-style research and development. And I don't think those are working out very well. I mean, they're just not, they're very cumbersome. I mean, intellectual property document is getting worse rather than better. Larger and larger numbers of people are paying no attention to it. Open source is getting more of a foothold simply because it's so cumbersome to try to obey all the rules of these interlocking style IP directorates. And without that, it's very difficult to make any money from biotech research. There was the regulatory capture thing, which they sort of did pretty effectively. I mean, you can go, if you're a very large company with a large budget, you can go and basically hire members of national governments to go out and reform their regulatory things to give you a more friendly business climate. And you can tell them, well, you know, the voters would never go for this, but eventually they'll come around. I mean, we'll just present this food as a fait accompli, and we'll sort of, you know, promote this as our form of official futurity, and eventually we'll sort of overcome this popular resistance, and, you know, people will come around, and, you know, the food is cheaper, and in the long run, this is always going to work. But the difficulty there is that politicians don't actually eat genetically modified food. The wealthy and the powerful do not want to eat it. You know, they don't. So, you know, you've got a severe problem there. I mean, it's the old IBM problem, IBM term of art. Do you eat your own dog food? You know, and the first time I heard an IBM executive say this, I thought, what the hell is he saying? You know, because it was kind of a vile thing to suggest that people would eat dog food. But what this gentleman meant to say was, do you, as a means of your own company, do you consume your own products because you think they really make you more efficient, right? In other words, you know, at IBM, they ate their own dog food in the sense that, like, they used IBM laptops and they used IBM software and they used IBM Six Sigma practices within IBM in order to sort of refine what IBM was doing. Do Monsanto executives eat genetically modified food? Now, I think many of them would like to. And especially the engineers in Monsanto and, you know, in similar companies would probably like to eat the food. I mean, I think they sincerely believe it's safe, but I don't believe their wives or their mothers will let them eat the food. I mean, really, if you come up with sort of a bottle of GMO baby food with like the little hooked biotechnology danger emblem on the side and say, okay, we're bringing out our firstborn child here. And, and we're going to just like dip the little rubber spoon into the gel and like slip it between the baby's lips. Well, you're laughing, right? Because it makes you feel really anxious. You're just not going to go there. I mean, really, the hand trembles, right? It's like, why didn't you go there? Why wasn't that job one? GMO baby food. Like, your baby will be a better baby. Like the Gerber baby food. I mean, you understand what baby food promotion looks like, right? And babies sort of have to eat this sort of pureed goo, basically, before they advance to solid food. So you would think that like genetically modified baby food would have been the thin edge of the wedge. I mean, this is the first consumer, right? And this stuff that he's eating is sort of unnatural colors and in little jars. And so, why not the baby? I mean, if it's really better food, and you really want to sort of like educate the future citizen to like eat this sort of official future food, why weren't babies the first ones eating it? And why weren't they poor babies? Right? I mean, if you were a genius PR guy within a GMO outfit, why didn't you go with the golden rice angle? These children, the children in the refugee camps of Darfur, look at their stick-thin little limbs, But we can like bring them this cheap, life-enhancing, vitamin-enriched food. They won't be blind. The flies will cease to feast on their sores. You can see us shoveling this into them, Okay, yeah, it's cheap, it's kind of mass-produced, but look at them restored to life and health. The little refugee children, capering, enjoying life. They're solid. They're as tall as the Dutch now. They're so well nourished by, our technical intervention. Where was that approach? I mean, why didn't that work, And like, why was that failure so conspicuous, And you think about it and you start chuckling, but, this is not like a sarcasm. This would have been like a very sensible and simple kind of way to break through these boundaries of social resistance. I mean, who could tell you, oh no, we would prefer to have the Darfur children starve? No. Our red-green struggle principles insist that our struggle should include starving these vitamin-deprived children. I mean, that would have just been sort of the white wedge and the red, forces. It just simply would have burst the bounds of social resistance, but they couldn't really do it. I mean, they couldn't do it and for like the reasons that they can't inflict it on their own family. And second, they can't do it because that product doesn't exist. Nobody's thought to make such a product. They would prefer to do things like engineer insecticide into, the genetics of a wheat plant because they feel that somehow like, I don't know, it kind of refines their distribution network. They don't have to sell insecticide in one package and the seeds in another package. They can just kind of reify it and build the insecticide into the seeds. Okay, that's like an interesting business model for doing a thing like this, but it's a business model which is so fully integrated into a very weird way of doing business that it doesn't really make much sense as an intervention. I mean, to make really cheap food that would make refugee children healthy, that's like a really cool idea, whereas to like build poisons directly into the genetics of food crops is like a crazy idea. I mean, to anybody except somebody who's just trying to like reify their value chain. It's just very difficult culturally to sort of make that sound attractive, whereas the other thing has just sort of never been explored. I mean, nobody went there, they can't go there, maybe they tried it, they didn't have enough money to do it, nobody would pay them to do that, there wasn't an immediate payoff there, the return on investment was too low. So, we've really ended up with this kind of very elaborate and frail kind of neoliberal biotech, which is now kind of going down the tubes along with the people who supported it. So, you know, I have to wonder, I mean, I kind of wonder, it's failing on the everyday use level, I guess you would say. And I have to do this again. After hearing our earlier speaker, I have to reframe what I'm doing here. Okay, I'm like this international global guy. And I like brought this here in my car trunk so that by like distributing this to you, I'm like empowering the shadow economy by like distributing bits of locally produced microcredit candies to a group of, I just love that so much. Right. So, you know, being a science fiction writer, you know, and finding that like this has failed me, naturally my butterfly interests turns to other areas. I'd like to, you know, recite a few of these briefly, because I know when you're hanging out with science fiction writers, you want to hear something like wacky and futuristic. So, you know, let me just run off a few things that I think are really intellectually sexy in the kind of transagriculture space, as they would call it. First, single-celled genetic stuff. I really think engineering crop plants is not a very good deployment of this technology because there's just too many developmental steps between the DNA in a stem cell and a fully expressed animal or plant. You know, as I argued in a book of mine 10 years ago, Tomorrow Now, I really think that DNA is it's an industry best suited to single-celled organisms. Bacterial DNA, I think, is where it's at. And at a recent Long Now Foundation speech, one of the people said that anything that a plant can do, a single cell can do. That's not quite true, but basically any chemical product or protein product, single sort of molecular pure product, like a sugar, for instance, is much better done through a single-celled organism. And you can't get, say, an apple or a beefsteak because they're just not genetic products. I mean, a beefsteak requires an animal to sort of run around, exercise itself. You know, the tissue has to develop. You can't print these things out because, you know, it's muscle tissue which has to be sort of stressed over the living period of an animal. But most of the items that are in a beefsteak, you know, amino acids, proteins, and so forth, you could squeeze out, you know, on a single cell level much more effectively, cheaper, faster than you can by growing a cow or a sheep or a pig into an adult life. So I'm keenly interested in this. I'm especially interested in cellulosic single cell technology. There's an effort in the United States to turn weed crops into ethanol. A gentleman named Vinod Khosla is sort of the evangelist for this effort. He's a Silicon Valley startup guy who wants to do some genetically modified single cells and use them to ferment basically weeds and turn the cellulose into a burnable alcohol. And he's worked this out in a kind of exquisite high-tech green detail about how this might actually help us with carbon emission problems. Because if you go and grow all these plants, harvest them, turn them into ethanol, they actually end up fixing a lot of carbon in the soil. It's one kind of car that Americans could drive that would actually, over the long term, suck carbon dioxide out of the sky and put it back down into the ground. Now this is like a really interesting business model, and there is a lot of potential energy in cellulose. Cellulose is quite difficult to crack industrially, but biotechnologically, we've got all kinds of animals that can crack cellulose. Termites, for instance, anything that eats wood, any large animal with a rumen where it sort of ferments grass using biotechnological organisms. Yeah, I'm keenly interested in cellulosic ethanol for non-food reasons. Not that we eat it, not that we pick up the trembling spoon and put it between the baby's innocent little toothless lips. This is a trans-agriculture thing that helps us drive cars and clean the sky. Like two really serious problems. Baby food, not that serious a problem, except, you know, in Darfur and areas where people can't get any food. These other kinds of applications for biotechnology, I think, might go somewhere. Similarly, I'm very interested in human internal flora. I think it's only quite recently that people have begun looking at the contents of people's guts. Like, what are all these single-celled organisms actually doing inside our body? I mean, normally we ignore them because it's sort of embarrassing, fecal, and Freudian. But in point of fact, we've got vast numbers, I mean, a jungle of single-celled things living inside ourselves. We have no idea who they are, you know, how long they've been there, what they want from us. They're older than mankind, much older than mankind. We can't get rid of them. I mean, there's not a single human being whose gastrointestinal tract is sterile. It's not physically possible. That, you know, if you did that, you would die. So, you know, if you really want to do some transagriculture, and, you know, on a very personal level, there isn't any more personal form of transagriculture than your own intestinal flora, right? I mean, really, I mean, just stuff that grows inside of you, right? I mean, it's not a garden, it's a jungle, right? I mean, nobody's ever practiced agriculture in there, except, you know, through eating antibiotics, which are basically like throwing napalm, you know, out of a helicopter and just killing the jungle on the ground, you know, with Agent Orange in large doses. Nobody has ever come up. I mean, you're starting to see just a little bit of it, what they call probiotics, which are, you know, things like yogurts, where you eat this lactobacillus, and there's sort of this pretense that lactobacillus will be good for you and can help you. Okay, if you drink a lot of milk, maybe lactobacillus could help, because, you know, it helps you digest milk. And, you know, well, you know, many human beings can't digest milk. I mean, you happen to be able to do it because, you know, in your area of the planet, blue-eyed blonde people, who are only 10,000 years old, by the way, you know, are mutants who can digest milk very effectively. And the sort of the Dutch cheese diet does not work for a third of the planet's population. Asian people do not digest milk very well at all. I mean, they just don't. You know, they didn't co-evolve with a prehistoric dairy industry like you did. So, you know, in theory, you could get some kind of lactobacillus that would actually enable Asian people to digest milk. Or maybe you could engineer a lactobacillus that would enable Dutch people to digest cheese super effectively. In which case, like, maybe, you know, 4 or 5 grams of cheese might see you through a whole day, right? Nobody's actually studied that. I mean, nobody's ever tried to, like, crack cheese inside the human body in the way that you would crack petroleum. You know, it's a science fictional idea now. You know, it sounds exotic now. We don't know very much about how to do this now. But it's like a super trans-agricultural idea, right? It's like, who's going to do it? Do you go and buy Monsanto-branded interior, you know, floral organisms? Is it up to you? Is it like a Web 2.0 thing? You know, I was like, my gastrointestinal tract has only open source microbes, and I don't really trust them, you know, I want to do my own, you know. It's like, oh my gosh, you know, my startup was bought by Yahoo, and, you know, now my stomach won't behave, you know. It's not that far away, because it's about as intimate as we can get. And tinkering with your own organisms inside your body, alien organisms, is much, much, much more socially acceptable than science fiction notions like tinkering with your egg cells, stem cells, sperm cells, trying to breed a super baby, cloning yourself, these kind of cornball-style robot notions. I mean, they don't get a lot going on the ground. Messing with your internal organisms, something we do every day. Every day, really. So the internal flora thing, possible new frontier there. Mitochondria food. I don't know if you've ever heard of this stuff. It's kind of a minor vogue for this going on in California. Substance called Juvenon, Juvenon. It's actually the trade name for pills that basically they present, I think, 3 different kinds of chemical that are specifically burned by the mitochondria being the power plant in the cell. I mean, if you go to the Juvenon site and read their rhetoric, it's all about sort of avoiding the aging process. It does not do that. I mean, Juvenon does not make you younger. However, I have eaten it. It does work. It's a nutraceutical. It's not a drug. It's not a vitamin. It's present in your body already. It's something that your mitochondria eat. You eat some Juvenon, you're going to get a little hyper. Not in like a methadone style. You don't start, it's not like a West Coast acid test style kind of, you're not like losing it completely, but it definitely has some cognitive effects. I mean, when I eat Juvenon, I find my ability to remember proper names suddenly comes back. Just like very odd. And I'm in my mid-50s. I've got a lot of, aging guy cognitive deficits. Juvenon has, I haven't measured it, but it definitely has an effect along that line. It's completely legal. You cannot possibly make this stuff illegal. It's in your body already. I mean, if your mitochondria were not using this, you would turn into a heap of jelly. So it's not a narcotic. It's just part of cellular metabolism. But they found out what it was. They refined it. It comes in this little chalk-like pill, kind of a horse pill. If you're under 50, I would recommend eating maybe a quarter of one. Recommended dose is like 2 a day. I wouldn't do that unless you're over 70. I don't own this thing. I'm not a stockholder in it. I'm interested in it because on an everyday use value, this stuff's got some legs. That'll do it. It'll do it for you, And I'm wondering what else is waiting in the wings. Narcotics at work. These aren't narcotics, but it's an intervention. It's an intervention in human biochemistry, Juvenon. And, elderly baby boomers, sooner or later, they're going to fall on this stuff with glad cries of glee. They've kind of got to. So, see how we're doing here. Oh, yeah. On to Torino and the glorious slow food movement. I've decided to stay in Italy for a couple of years here. I've kind of made it my stomping ground, and I'm writing a lot of Italian science fiction these days. It's just, I don't know why it is that I find this place so alluring, but I just do. I just can't help going there. And, I would recommend the slow food movement as a study for people who would hang out with the likes of V2 and unstable media. Because I think this is like a really very interesting and significant and moderately successful effort in kind of tactical media organization. Because here we've got this guy, Carlo Petrini, Carlene from Bra, as they call him, baby boomer character, kind of mild 68er figure, communist, spaghetti communist guy, Italian communist. The mayor of Torino is a communist. In Italy, the communists are the party of honest government. I don't know how to break this to you, but very odd by American standards, but you live in Italy, you get used to it. The guy's a communist. And he was an underground radio personality and a journalist for Il Manifesto, the communist rag out of Rome, one of the better newspapers in the country. So he's basically a media activist who sort of decided to go into popular organization, really. And from a left-wing perspective, but not really in a very loud way. He's a, I guess you'd call him a visionary, or what it really is, it's a rare example of Savoyard cultural imperialism. It really is very, very much of Piedmont, and an obscure place in the world, one very dear to my heart. I can't explain the romance there, but they really sort of captured me. It's Piedmontese cultural imperialism, and Piedmont is a strange little area, on the border of France and Italy, which was, an independent country for several centuries, and it's kind of one of Europe's many kind of suppressed micronations. you know, in the grand scheme of things, it probably isn't that much more important than, say, southern Belgium. This is a rare example of one of their things which just sort of caught on a global level. And it's particularly because of the promotional genius of this guy, Petrini, and really his ability to just come up with a formulation that has like captured people's imagination in some important way. Now, he and his friends, who were basically a dining party, I mean, Carlo Petrini has many friends, and mostly it's because he's a dinner host. I mean, this is basically what he did. I mean, he wasn't a political theorist. He's just this kind of radio personality, a guy with a gift of gab. But he really is very convivial, and, you know, he'd like to get together and dine with his friends, and his friends were mostly pop stars and left-wing philosophers and, you know, your basic sort of Italian intelligentsia, cultural activist, flotsam kind of guys. But, you know, basically they wanted to go hang out with Carlo because he could really, like, put on a feed, you know? And in an Italian perspective, this is, like, quite important. I mean, you know, you're this exhausted rock star, you know, Fabrizio De Andre, you know, you've been out gigging endlessly, and when was the last time you had a decent meal like Mama used to cook? And you would go over to Carlo's and there'd be like, you know, people would just like sit there and eat and gossip for 4 or 5 hours. And, you know, as this dinner party started getting larger and more famous people showed up, and he suddenly realized he's sort of onto a good thing here, and that it was under assault by fast food. So when McDonald's arrived on the shores of Piemonte, actually in Italy, Carlo, who was kind of a counter-globalist avant la lettre, got his pals together and they did like a street intervention and went down there in their beards and their bell-bottoms outside the McDonald's and had a manifestazione, and they were banging on their pasta pans and sort of making this loud noise, and, you know, and they got a lot of press, and it was basically a publicity stunt. But then Carlo sort of thought the issue through, and he realized that, you know, McDonald's actually had the wind at their back because of the kind of methods of production and the just sort of the driving forces of globalization. It wasn't that their food was so great, because their food's not really great. It was their business model and their sort of international business organization and the economies of scale that allowed McDonald's to sort of invade Piedmont instead of the Piedmontese invading the USA with their really much superior food. So he came up with this network scheme called the Slow Food Movement. And it was named in English. It's not named Slow Food in Italian. The official name is Slow Food, and its intention from the beginning was to be global. It was one of the first really effective counter-globalist movements, and it centers around conviviality and pleasure, rather than the right, the left, the struggle, the people, the discourse, the multitudes. It's really about sitting down with other people for 3 or 4 hours in a kind of, domotic, urban, public space, I guess you'd have to call it. You know, and defending that as a cultural practice and sort of imposing it on other people to the extent that you can. So he set up these cadres, kind of local franchises, much like a McDonald's franchise market, that are called the Presidia. And the Presidia are local groups of gourmets and food snobs and, you know, left-wing counterculture activists, whatever, who go out into specific areas and look for regionally produced heritage foods. And then they are found and archived. They sort of reported up a chain of command to Petrini's graybeard council, who decide whether this particular food is worthy of being curated. And if they think that it is, then they go in and seize the means of production. I mean, they come in with the slow food cadres. Actually, they'll buy the land, they'll buy equipment, they'll buy, you know, whatever's necessary, a butcher shop, a baker shop, new farm equipment, whatever is necessary to sort of curate this local food, kind of a privatized version of the European domain of control system. And then it's sort of folded very quietly into what's basically a classic European heritage economy, but from a food perspective. So European food heritage economy and centered in Piedmont. And the Italian Cultural Ministry is one of the major arms of the slow food movement. Not in an obvious way, but because they sort of know which side their gourmet bread is buttered on. And this has become really quite a nice little earner, in Piedmont. European food heritage in Piedmont is a big deal. And you can see it in things like, the publications of Petrini's publishing house, Slow Food Editore. I'm very interested in these books. They sort of help me learn Italian. A particular one I've got in my bag over the hotel. I'm just now paging my way through it. It's a tome called 500 Piedmontese Excellences. And it's just 500 kinds of local food, native to Piedmont that you really can't get anywhere else, supposedly, that have all been curated by the Slow Food Presidia. Now, it would be wrong to say that these things are health food. One of the favorites, my personal favorite in there is a substance called, the chocolate salami of the Pope. That's the literal translation of this particular, what is it? It's a candy? Well, it's a chocolate salami, basically. And it's made with eggs and butter and hazelnuts, ground up hazelnuts, sort of a hazelnut butter, very common, and an orange mandarin liqueur, and then kind of like folded in cane sugar with like a chocolate hazelnut filling. Okay, if you ate one of these every day, you would die. They're not a health food thing. They must be incredibly fattening. But, if you were like having a really bad love affair, one of these might save you. I don't know. It's like some kind of exotic comfort food. He's like, he's left me. Bring me the chocolate salami of the Pope. And I think it might get you through, It would extend your lifespan in some way. And as a science fiction writer, I just find these things, they really intrigue me. I mean, in some sense, they really are kind of fantasy as a new urban way of life. I don't think anybody's ever eaten all 500 of the Piedmontese excellences. I don't know how long it would take you to find and eat all of those. I don't know if you would survive doing it. I mean, I don't plan to do it. But I would point out that, having lived in Piedmont for a while, my health has improved, actually. Quite a lot. Not because I eat slow food, mostly I eat Arab fast food. Because the Italians don't go into fast food except for pizza, so the Muslim emigres have ended up seizing the McDonald's market. But I actually think it has a lot to do with Turinese urban design more than anything else. It's like leaving Los Angeles and giving up my car really helped my health. I walk everywhere I go, and I kind of breathe a little more freely, even though Torino is very polluted. And, the food's a bit more expensive, but I don't drive out and get some. I sort of walk over and get something from the local market. And, I tend to cook more than I did. And, I'm not a health food person. I don't, paying a lot of attention to your health has a major opportunity cost, and you're not really all that likely to be healthy anyway. Thinking that watching what you eat makes you healthy is, I think, wrong, or at least easy to mistake. Exercise is as much as important, and the things that you breathe are very important, and also just staying away from automobiles, which kill more people than wars. I used to drive in Los Angeles. I drove in Los Angeles for a year. Every day I'd see 4 or 5 fatalities. Terrible business. Much more dangerous than genetically modified food. A hurtling multi-ton thing plows through people. Look at it statistically, really. It's just much more risky. But, my health has improved. And I kind of like the bald way Petrini, approaches some of these issues. People ask him, well, isn't this slow food much more expensive than the sort of cheap, easy food? And he says, yes, people should spend more on food. It's like Italians spend 10% of their income on food and 11% of their income on telecommunications, he says. So, stop calling your friends on the phone and have them over for dinner. It's an argument. And it's also a regional competitive advantage. If you add up the slow food lifestyle, let's say you spend an hour cooking and an hour convivially dining every day. Okay, that's like a moonlighting job, basically, over a long period. That's a lot of time, a whole lot of time. But it's one of the few things that Piedmontese society actually has that they could sell to other people. They're really willing to do this, and they won't stop. They don't give up the 2-hour lunch. If you meet people from Piedmontese, the power brokers within that society, the politicians, the movers and shakers, the heavy industry people, when they talk to one another, I'm not one of them, but I'm a journalist, so I love to eavesdrop. They talk about food. It's really strange. You would think being communists and sort of, red-hot struggle radical guys, that they would be out there discussing, Giorgio Agamben or something. But no, they will sit and talk to each other about noodles for an hour and a half. Oh, my grandmother's noodles, and my grandfather, he was from so-and-so, and that's where they had the truffles. And you realize that this is like some kind of social lubricant in that society. It's actually, the ability to talk extremely seriously about food in Piemonte is like a form of social capital, right? It's like dressing properly. It's just like something they have, which gives them, okay, well, I can't shoot him because, he gave me his aunt's recipe. It's just kind of it's a social bond that they have, very alien by American standards, but one of the things about that society that I find really intriguing, and alien, So, that seems to be how it works. Spend more, eat less, use a McDonald's-style system, invest a number of hours per day, use that as a regional competitive advantage, sell your own heritage and other people's heritage to food tourists, salt it away, come up, set up a series of sub-rosa agreements with the Foreign Ministry, with the Food and Agriculture Organization, with NGOs, invest in urban conviviality, try and get the creative class on board, publicize it through a whole series of newspapers, magazines, public appearances, through the sort of social forum style things. It's a going enterprise. It makes a lot of money. Not for Petrini, he's not a mogul. His outfit clears about 20 million euros a year. That does not interest him. He's not a businessman, he's a cultural figure. He's making a lot of money for the Regione Piemonte. Enough so that they treat him as if he were an industrial mogul of some kind. He's really become this venerated figure, and people love to be photographed with him. He's Carlin from Bra, everybody calls him by his nickname. He's just kind of this beloved guy. He doesn't seem to have an enemy in the world, despite his really quite radical politics and his insights. There are only 80,000 people in the slow food movement, which sounds like a lot, but that's not really that much bigger than, say, the Adbusters group, if you're familiar with them. Out of Vancouver, Adbusters. About 80,000 people, more or less, who hang out with Adbusters, do this at a buy nothing day kind of thing. I really think this particular movement could be much, much bigger. And I think Petrini thinks so too, because during this recent financial crisis, he got up and sort of gave this very chest-pounding speech about how his method of industrial production, this kind of loose, networked, rural yet glocalized, I guess you'd have to do, an ugly word, but the only one we have. His glocalized method is going to come to the fore. That the McDonald's method is collapsing, and his exciting new kind of digitized, glocalized, convivial, cultural thing should come to the fore. When he's telling this to a crowd of about 5,000 people, most of them peasants. Oddly enough, Carlino, who's from a very small town, he's a small town boy, he really likes peasants. He's like super into peasants and wants peasants to be okay, and he's like a labor union guy for peasants, and he really sort of likes the peasantry. You know, he thinks they're salt of the earth, and he sort of wants to go there. I think there's a 21st century model of this, kind of the 80s model. It will probably eat the slow food movement out from within. Not peasants, but probably green guerrillas, urban agriculture people who can make a lot of the same arguments. I mean, peasants are going away. There just aren't that many. And no matter how hard Carling tries to protect them by sort of seizing the means of production and producing them, that's just a very tough row to hoe. I mean, it's like protecting an endangered species against the white fungus of urban expansion. But I think there's a useful model there. I mean, it is 20 years old. It's sort of done a lot. If you're really interested in issues like that, I'm not saying you should join the slow food movement, although you might want to. I have nothing against it. But I think you might want to study the way in which it was organized and these numbers of sort of cultural interventions that this social entrepreneur has come up with. I think it's really kind of an interesting model. And I'll finish off by distributing the rest of these, which come from the slow food fortress in Torino. It's called Italy. Italy, which has an English name. One of the most interesting grocery stores in the world, I have to think. It's the only grocery store I've ever been to with a political indoctrination compound in the basement. These are kind of super slow candies, you know, and they're just kind of like they're a proof of concept, you know. You can just see the foreigners lined up outside the place. They're just going at it hammer and tongs, you know. They're not kidding about it, and I know it's just sort of like packaged, and you can like eat it and just, it's all yours. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bruce, for this praise of Italian culinary colonization, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something like that.
I mean, I'm asking myself, well, right now, you know, I mean, did you mean to sort of give the answer to the question you asked in the first half of your talk in the second? I mean, is the question why, or you know, is the fact that this biotech food stuff is not a successful business model? I mean, is this to do with what you describe in the second part as, I mean, you know, it's got to do with life, doesn't it? And you know, life as a sort of creative process, right? That we haven't understood from the DNA to the organism, as you say, which, well, is true. Maybe, you know, the DNA is not the best way to understand life to begin with.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, is there something in this? I mean, you take pains to describe the sort of the vitality of eating, of the, you know, the social process of absorbing the stuff and so on. I mean, I don't know. I'm just sort of wondering if you set it up in that way, you know, that you say, okay, I'm posing these questions and here's the answer, and maybe, you know, you could link this a bit more explicitly if you want to. I mean, I don't know, just
right. Well, you know, I don't want to wax all mystical about the subject, because, you know, in point of fact, if you watch people eat, they're not sort of super. I mean, now, there are only sort of 80,000 people in slow food movement and other kinds of like real food fetishism, you know, have sort of small cults. I mean, generally people eat what's convenient. I mean, they kind of know it's bad for them, but they're like busy that day. They've got to take the child to whatever. You know, in the United States, I think they really are increasingly just trapped in this kind of whirlpool of you know, neoliberal consumerism, to frame it in a you know, European context. But really, in the United States, people are left with very little free time to do things that do not involve the free market. I mean, they've just had practically every aspect of their life commodified and kind of turned into, you know, something that you can pay for very quickly. I mean, it's just every aspect of American daily life has been turned into an economic transaction, and the way that, like, the American greeting, "Have a nice day," means thank you for this economic transaction. And, you know, you may have wondered, not being an American, what that means, and that's what it means. Thank you for giving me the money. You can go away now. Have a nice day. You know, and it's difficult. I mean, it's really a novelist problem to talk about these kinds of deep cultural issues. But, you know, there's a lot of aspects of food that are not very deep and cultural. And, you know, the idea that we eat food because we want to be healthy is not really the case. I mean, we eat food because we're hungry and because we get weak otherwise and because we sort of have to have it. But the thing that puzzles me, really, is like, why is there so little enthusiasm for high-tech food? I mean, why was that not made sexy? I mean, there is some sort of high-tech food. Like if you go into a weightlifter's camp, you know, or a gym, you'll see all kinds of sort of chromium picolinate and kind of big jars of whey-style stuff, you know, and it's sort of food that does not bear any coherent relationship to its natural origin. And, you know, you sort of eat it with spoons and, you know, you sort of go on these crash diet stuff. But, you know, in point of fact, that food, I mean, weightlifters are not particularly healthy people. I mean, really, I mean, they're basically people who want to change the shape of their bodies and are willing to injure themselves and, you know, take odd hormonal treatments and really kind of warp themselves in pursuit of some kind of body image goal. I mean, one thing that like really I find odd is that if you look into biological studies, like say with rats, hamsters, dogs even, there's all these defined diets that have been scientifically invented, like Purina rat chow for the scientific rat. And just, you know, because you want to feed every rat identical stuff so that you can use them as control groups. There is no Purina biologist chow, right? I mean, if you're a biologist or a nutritionist, why don't you just eat a medically defined diet like your rats, you know, or your other, I mean, given that you could define, in theory, I mean, if you claim you can feed rats a perfect rat food that sort of makes them the best specimen possible, why don't you invent one for the human race, and why don't you eat your own dog food? I mean, why don't you, as a biologist, eat biological chow, you know? Why don't they eat their dog food? Why isn't this promulgated? I mean, why isn't it sexy? Why isn't it exciting? I mean, why, you know? I don't understand it. I mean, it's really a puzzle to me because, you know, it is a technology. Why doesn't it have the cachet of other forms of technology? I mean, where is the trans aspect of it? You know, where's the, I mean, why isn't it super agriculture, hyper agriculture, ultra agriculture? Why does it have to be Franken agriculture or trans agriculture? You know, why, right? I mean, where is the secret, where's the missing key there? I mean, it's really a cultural studies problem, like a material culture problem. I don't know. You know, maybe it'll take a philosopher to unriddle this, but that's really what I find most interesting about it. And why didn't it catch fire?
Question. Yeah, I have some question about the beginning of the cyberpunk. You said we have no biopunk today, but remember the first novels of the saga. I mean, drugs, medicine, and the nervous system were there, you know, a lot. And then the digital aesthetics become similar to the minimalism, the cognitive minimalism of the Apple PowerBook, something like that. At the beginning, I remember it was something more carnal, more instinctive. And today, my question for you is even this hegemony of the code as the paradigm, even to describe life. So we have DNA artists, bioartists that play with this basic grammar, and they apply the code to genetics, and they play with the genetic kit, or even to food. We have been at the dinner in Brussels a few weeks ago, and they were using this kind of open source metaphor to describe everything, you know, open source food, recipes, kitchen. Yeah. And that's the other thing about this new media movement starting to deal with the living matter with many conceptual tools. And so to finish, it's even going back to slow food. It's, the success of slow food for me is even about the fact they are not Puritans. Outbuster is a perfect vegetarian, vegan, Puritan movement. Yeah. And even in the media art scene, you have this kind of very Puritanistic way to deal with the living matter.
Yeah.
Other people with a more Latin background, they don't know anything about technology or Protestantism. They have no, less Puritan.
Well, you know, I agree that they're not Puritans, or rather they promote themselves as not being Puritans. If you go and hang out at Italy, you actually see this sort of fascinating mixture of you know, left-wing Puritanism and even a kind of you know, modernist industrial minimalism applied to these like super exotic foods, like you know, cheese made of pig's milk, for instance, which is sort of packaged in this, very neatly packaged in this little jar, but then with sort of very restrained kinds of packaging as compared to, you know, conventional Italian packaging, which tends to be quite florid and Coca-Cola-like with elaborate wedding-style fonts and kind of beautiful golden Baroque touches. You know, it's just, I mean, I can't help it. I mean, I go to design school, so I like packaging. But you know, to me, I mean, it's really fascinating to sort of like watch them work their way, you know, in these particular little forms of cultural spaces. So, you know, in some ways, I mean, well, you know, Petrini's trinity is like good, clean, and fair. He wants food to be good in the sense that like it's sensual and satisfying and tastes good, and clean in the sense that like it doesn't damage things sustainably and, you know, doesn't involve chemistry or antibiotics or these other things. And then also fair because, you know, he's a leftist. And this weird combination, I mean, good, clean, and fair, I mean, usually you can have 2 out of the 3. I mean, if it's good and clean, it's not fair. If it's fair and clean, it's no good. If it's good and fair, it's unclean. You know? It's like with politicians. They can be sort of honest, smart, or effective, but never all at the same time. They're honest and effective, but stupid, or, you know, et cetera. You can run through the thing yourself. You know, I mean, the guy's sort of got a novelist's touch there. You know, and you know, slow food has continued to evolve over a long period. And I really think this latest financial crisis is sort of, it's unleashed the hidden 68er in Petrini, which was never really sort of deep below the surface. You know, if there's like some kind of really severe financial crash, I could easily imagine slow food renaming and sort of rearming themselves as some kind of left-wing food distribution network, kind of a Doctors Without Borders for food. I mean, you know, if you couldn't get food because like the grocery couldn't get financing and there was suddenly no food and you were in your basic, you know, living out of a car trunk, undocumented alien style of existence, boy, to know somebody in slow food would be really, really helpful, right? And they're very public-spirited people. There might be, you know, 5% of us or whatever, but those are the 80,000 who really, really care. So, you know, I think they've got use value. They're kind of working it out on the ground in an exciting and different way. And you know, and you're right that the sort of the pleasure and the sort of hidden early Freudian sexuality, really, of food consumption is a big thing for them. And it's part of the allure of Italian life, really. Sort of the positivity of it. Another question?
Yeah, there's a question.
Yeah.
In response to your own question, actually, like why it never became so sexy, this high-tech food, and since you also named Monsanto, and since you named Darfur baby food, I think that the approach of biotech food has been also to try to develop seeds that are more suitable for particular localities in the world. And then the strategy of Monsanto was to bring genetically modified seeds to those areas to make the baby food, so to say. And the thing that strikes me with that act is that they made infertile seed to make these people immediately depending on Monsanto.
Right.
Do you think the fact that this has happened right from the start could have kind of taken out the positive energy out of this movement? Like to me, it's a very dark thing. I have friends in social sciences that have been investigating this issue, and
right.
It's quite depressing thesis.
Well, I don't think that happened at the beginning. I think that was actually something that the biotech industry attempted to learn from the computer industry. I mean, basically, somebody went to business school and got promoted into the board of directors and said, look, this is business 301. What we want to do is sort of move into the common domain, come up with some piece of IP, lock it in, and then like lock everybody else out. And you know, a seed which does not reproduce is basically a dongle mechanism, right? I mean, this is a piece of software that doesn't reproduce. You know, and that has not worked out within the computer milieu because, you know, the population rebelled more or less. I mean, they didn't want to pay. And, you know, it's just basically the Microsoft model of kind of domination of the industry. You just become a de facto monopoly. You sort of seize the means of production. You suborn the Justice Department. You just overawe everyone with a tremendous amount of money that you're making. And, you know, you end up with sort of Microsoft food. Now, who would really want to eat Microsoft food? I mean, if you saw, you know, Intel Inside, you know, if you saw a Microsoft label on a carton of milk, you know, would you feel happy about it? I mean, knowing the way that they behave. I mean, knowing their business practices. And is that really a sustainable practice even within a business model? I mean, how long can you lock in seeds like that? I mean, agriculture is like, what, 20,000 years old? How long do you expect to maintain an intellectual property model of that kind? 1 generation, 3 generations, 5 generations, 10, until the sun expands? You know, I mean, people have got to eat. I mean, you know, it's an act of adventurism. It doesn't really, you know, it's a robber baron tactic. And you know, of course it's sinister, and certainly people resent it. I mean, they resent it for a large number of reasons, some of which make sense to me and some of which do not. But, you know, I mean, it's just it's an imposition on agriculture of a business model from another industry entirely. And that business model has not worked out well. I mean, we've seen similar efforts from the finance structure, you know, and many others in airlines, so forth and so on. You know, younger people today, they've seen this done. They don't consider it exciting. It's not like, oh, well, industry consolidation is the way forward. They don't want to eat at McDonald's. They don't, you know, they don't want everybody to wear Levi's jeans. They're not sort of they don't find mass production, mass consumption very exciting. They're much more into sort of long tail things. So, you know, I don't think it requires a lot of organized banner toting to like make this business model fail. It doesn't work on the face of it. You know, it's sort of like collapsing under its own weight. You know, I mean, you can do it if you do it entirely sub rosa. You know, if nobody's aware that you've like cornered the market with your interlocking IP things, you can do that. But the day when that would not be obvious to people is just kind of gone. And it is obvious to people. Everybody knows how it works. And, you know, people in business don't want to do it.
To that respect, would it then help to have a Creative Commons license on genetically engineered food or seeds?
Well, you know, that's a newie. I mean, you know, Creative Commons, I mean, it's 19 years old now. Well, not the original one, but, you know, open source stuff, free software stuff. You know, it's a social invention to kind of, you know, rename the commons into this other way and then sort of write. I mean, you know, it's the commons rewritten under kind of a neoliberal framework. Because if you look at sort of Creative Commons, it's basically the same as a business contract, only sort of upside down and inside out. Okay, it's got the same problems, in my opinion. Like, if you release something under Creative Commons, how are you supposed to know? You know, just who's keeping track of the Creative Commons infrastructure of what's actually usable and what isn't quite usable? You know, I mean, if there's 1 million Creative Commons products, or 10 million, or 100 million, how do you find out? How do you negotiate those licenses? How do you go to somebody and say, oh, well, you know, I wanted to use your photograph, you know, but I see that you don't allow it used for commercial purposes, except we're like celebrating the retirement of my uncle, so it's actually kind of a family thing and not really commercial. Right? I mean, how do you like draw these lines? I mean, to me it seems, I mean, it's an interesting place for us to work right now. I'm not sure it's a thing that's going to work out over the longer term. you know, it's really kind of up for grabs. I mean, you know, the Washington consensus has gone down the tubes. Nobody really knows what to make of it. I mean, maybe the South Americans have some answers for us here. We can go hang out with the Brazilians, you know, they're into like all kinds of cool open source stuff. We've got this weird Piedmontese global model that might help us some little bit. It's kind of like you hide your McDonald's structure into this sort of web of convivial social practice. The open source thing, a Web 2.0 model might help a little bit. You know, we just sort of all give like one French fry, and at the end it's sort of a giant Jesus-like feast of the fishes and, you know, bread loaves, you know. I really don't know, but, you know, I really think, you know, in the past 18 months we've entered the real 21st century. I mean, whatever the hell shape it's coming, it like started about, you know, a year and a half ago. And the sort of Bush interregnum, the war on terror bubble thing, you know, the period 89, 2008. Some kind of weird Belle Epoque that ended badly. And now we're into whatever the real 21st century is about. It's very, very different. I mean, about all I can tell you is I'm not scared. You know, I mean, everybody's terrified. I'm just not scared. Not that I refuse to go there. I just can't get that interested in the fear. It's boring. You know, I mean, a financial panic to me is more boring than the war on terror panic. But, you know, which I always knew was hokum. You know, just an excuse. You know, and that's sort of what we're seeing now. I'm just not scared. I'm not gonna play.